right, this is how we do a pre-trip at Waukesha County Technical College's truck driving program. First of all, we want to do a general overview of the vehicle. We want to stand about 10 or 15 feet back from the front of the vehicle, and we want to check out maybe the obvious things that could be wrong with it. We're going to check our clearance lights, make sure they're the proper color, they're clean and free of debris, they're not cracked, not falling out, nuts and bolts that hold them on are tight. We're going to check our mirrors on the passenger side and driver's side, on both the hood and the side of the doors. Checking to make sure nothing's hanging down, no cracks, no chips in the back of the mirrors. Nuts and bolts that hold them on are tight. We're going to check to make sure our grill, our hood, our headlights are not falling off, are not properly secured. Nuts and bolts that hold them on are tight. We're going to check our lights. We're going to check to make sure our lights are the proper color. Our turn signals, our four-ways, our headlights, our high beams, our low beams, our reflectors. They're clean and free of debris. The lenses are not cracked. The lenses are not fogged over. I'm going to check my bumper. Make sure my bumper is mounted securely. Nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. The license plate is mounted securely. Nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. It's not falling off. I'm going to check the truck to make sure it's not leaning from side to side, indicating a possible issue with the suspension or the maybe a flat tire or low tire. I'm also going to look underneath the vehicle, checking to make sure that there's no leaks. And then I'm going to go to the passenger side of the vehicle. I'm going to pop the hood. Open up the hood coming up. And what I want to do is I want to do a general overview of the entire engine compartment on the passenger side. I'm going to check out my hoses, my wires, my cables, my fittings, my brackets. Checking to make sure everything's mounted securely. Nuts and bolts that hold everything on are tight. Alright. Our brackets, our braces, our cables, our hoses, our electrical fittings. And we're going to check to make sure that there are no overall leaks underneath the engine compartment. Alright. First thing we're going to do is we're going to check our alternator. We're going to check our alternator, make sure nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. We're going to check to make sure our fittings on our wires are not corroded, that they are tight. My wires are not cut, frayed, or damaged in any way. I'm going to check my belt, make sure it has no less than or no more than a ½ inch of play. My belt is not cut, worn, or frayed. I'm going to check my water pump. How I find that is I'm going to check my hose right here. It's about a 2-inch hose that comes off either the side of the radiator towards the bottom of it, or it comes off the bottom of the radiator somewhere down here and leads up into the bottom of the water pump. If we follow it, it comes underneath the frame here and comes up into the back of this part right here. All right, if it leads to the front, looks like it's belt driven. It's got a belt up here, okay? We're going to check that water pump to make sure that there are no leaks. The nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. We're going to check our belt to make sure our belt is not cut, frayed, or worn. And then it has no more than a ½ inch of play on it. We're going to check our oil. All right, this is the dipstick right here. I would pull it out, check to make sure my oil is between add and full. If I need to add some oil, I'm going to add some oil right here. If we are low, we're going to add a gallon at a time, and then we're going to recheck it. All right, now I'm going to go around to the driver's side of the vehicle. And I'm going to do a general overview again. I'll be checking all my hoses, my brackets, my wires, my nuts, my bolts. Checking to make sure my hoses, the fittings are all tight. There's no cuts, frays, or bulges in any of my wires or my hoses. I'm also checking to make sure that there are no leaks, air leaks, or fluid leaks all around the inside of the vehicle, inside the engine compartment. I'm going to check my coolant right here. I'm going to check my reservoir, making sure my reservoir, nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. I'm going to check my reservoir hoses to make sure all the fittings are tight. Make sure all the hoses that lead to it are not cut, frayed, or worn. I'm going to check to make sure my reservoir is not leaking and the fluid levels between add and full. Okay. I'm also going to check my windshield washer fluid. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this up before I leave for my day, and I'm going to keep an extra bottle in the truck just to make sure I have enough to make it through. I'm going to check the components on the inside of my engine compartment. That includes my air compressor, which is right here. Okay. I'm going to check my air compressor nuts and bolts to make sure my nuts and bolts are tight. I'm checking my air compressor, make sure that there are no leaks. I'm checking to make sure the hoses that lead to them, the fittings are tight. And the hoses are not cut, frayed, or worn. This air compressor is gear driven. I'm also going to check my power steering pump. My power steering pump, I can follow a hose from the power steering gearbox and the power steering reservoir. If I follow the hose from the power steering reservoir, it leads me right here. All right, it leads me right to my power steering pump. Okay, I'm going to check my power steering pump, make sure nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. I'm going to check my hoses, make sure the fittings are tight. I'm going to check to make sure my hoses are not cut, frayed, or worn in any way. My power steering pump is gear driven. All right, and there are no leaks. I'm going to check the frame of my vehicle right here, all the way back through here. I'm going to check nuts and bolts, making sure that there are no missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to check the nuts and bolts that are there, making sure that they are all tight. My frame is not bent, twisted, or welded. I'm going to go to my steering shaft here. My steering shaft right here, I'm going to check to make sure my steering shaft is not bent, twisted, or cracked, or missing any pieces. I'm going to go to my steering knuckle right here, making sure my steering knuckle is not cracked, bent, missing any pieces, or excessively loose. My power steering gearbox, which is right here, I'm going to check to make sure my power steering gearbox is mounted securely. Nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight. There are no leaks. The hoses that lead to it, the fittings are tight. And the hoses are not cut, frayed, or worn. I'm going to check my steering linkage, which starts here and goes all the way down into here, okay, into the back of the wheel. I'm going to check to make sure that there are no missing nuts or bolts, no missing cotter pins, no cracks, no missing pieces. The steering linkage is not bent, cracked, or missing any pieces. I'm going to check my suspension. I'm going to check my spring mounts, make sure my springs, my U-bolts, and my spring mounts in the back here, and my spring mount up here are not cracked, no missing pieces. My nuts and bolts that hold them on are tight. My U-bolts have not shifted, they're not cracked, or have not moved, indicating looseness. I'm going to check my shock absorber, which is right here. Checking to make sure that the nuts and bolts that hold it on the top and the bottom are tight. I'm going to grab my shock absorber about right here, and I'm going to try to move it very gently to make sure it's not loose. I'm going to check to make sure my shock absorber on the bottom has no leaks, indicating a possible problem with my shock. I'm going to come into the brake chamber here on brake hose. If you look right here, we have our brake hose. Okay, I'm going to check my brake hose fittings on here and here, checking to make sure that they are tight. I'm going to check my brake hose, make sure my brake hose is not cracked, not worn, and not bulged. It leads into the back of my brake chamber, which is right here. I'm going to check my brake chamber bolts, making sure that they are tight. Checking my brake chamber to make sure it's not bent, not cracked, not missing any pieces, and not excessively rusted. I'm going to check my slack adjuster and push rod, which is right here. Slack adjuster is right here, this unit right here. We're checking to make sure it's properly greased. My push rod And my pins are not bent. No missing pieces, no cracks. Okay? I'm gonna look inside here. I'm gonna look at my brake drums right here and my brake linings right here on the inside here. What I'm checking for is to make sure there's no cracks, no missing pieces, and my brake linings have no less than a 1/4 inch of material. Also with my slack adjuster and push rod, I want to tug on it. I want to make sure that it has no less than or no more than 1 inch of free play. No more than 1 inch of free play. I'm going to check my insides of my tires. And I'm going to check the outsides of my tires. Checking to make sure there's no cuts, no bulges. I'm going to check my tread to make sure there's no cord showing. And I check my tread depth with my tread depth gauge. Checking to make sure there's no less than 4/32 on the steer tires. I would check my valve stem cap and valve stem right here. Checking to make sure it's not cracked, not bent, not missing any pieces. And my valve stem cap is on it and it's tight. I would check my air pressure with my air pressure gauge, checking to make sure it's between 105 and 110 for air pressure on the front steer tire. I'm going to check my rims, make sure my rims are not cracked, not bent, not missing any pieces, and there's no welds. I'm going to check my lug nuts, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to check to make sure that they are all tight. I'm going to check to make sure that there are no rust streaks indicating possible looseness. I'm going to check my hub oil seal, which is right here. I'm going to check to make sure nuts and bolts that hold it on are tight, that there are no leaks. And my hub oil levels between add and full, I would check it on these lines right here. Now after this portion, which is the A portion, I would close the hood and I would continue on to my B portion.